Thank you for joining us today for this Optiv webinar presentation. At Optiv, our vision is to become the most advanced, most comprehensive, and most trusted partner for cybersecurity solutions. We provide a comprehensive suite of services and solutions to help you plan, build, and run successful cybersecurity programs. Our webinar and thought leadership programs provide our audiences with informative and insightful information and conversations to help enable your business to manage the demands of an increasingly connected world. With the power of more than 350 industry partners and more than 12,000 clients globally, we are excited to bring this knowledge to you through programs such as this. To learn more about Optiv, please visit our website at optiv.com. Now, please join us for our next webinar presentation.
Before we get into the panel discussion with my esteemed colleagues, Patrick Harding and Richard Bird, let's briefly set the stage for this conversation. Organizations today are making and have made large cybersecurity investments across many of the areas that you see on the slide. So we have cloud security, network security, endpoint, data access governance, and DLP are just some of the areas. But the current approaches still have us playing whack-a-mole to solve cybersecurity problems. Along with that, identity has started to crop up everywhere. Many of the tools in these areas already have some context of identity. And while they appear effective, they're often marginalized. We require lots of skilled personnel by stack to support all of these cybersecurity investments. The model is not sustainable. Can we agree at a minimum and at this moment that there's need for change? And at a given organization, we have a few key roles that are responsible for cybersecurity. With all the investments that we saw on the previous slide that are being made today, some of the individuals involved in that include, of course, the CIO that is strategically focused on all the IT systems and the support of the enterprise as a whole. Of course, we have the checkbook, the Chief Financial Officer, who's focused on the responsibility on the investment in all those cybersecurity technologies. The enterprise architect, or in some companies, the enterprise security architect, they're responsible for that holistic view of organization, strategy, and processes. And last but not least, the Chief Information Security Officer, who's responsible for maintaining the enterprise's information security assets and making sure that they're adequately protected. Each role has its place in the cybersecurity strategy and goals of the organization, but the CISO, in my opinion, is the largest instrument for change in that entire group. So what's keeping the CISO up at night, When we asked CISOs this question over the last few years, as the times have evolved, their responses have evolved. So in 2014, it's not knowing the location of sensitive or confidential data. And in 2015, talked about the battle of phishing. Also, I'm one breach away from being fired. To 2016, when some of the things were, with all my security experts, why are we still failing, right? The stakes have never been higher. Those kind of comments in relation to what is keeping the CISO up at night. But in all of that, what's A glaring omission, and the question you may be asking, and we're certainly asking, is why is identity access management not on that list? And there are a number of reasons why some CISOs don't own or don't control identity, and in some cases, perhaps they've actually even relinquished control of identity. And these reasons include identity living outside the CISO program or CISO office. Some CISOs didn't come up through IAM projects or programs, and most critically, identity has not historically been mapped to solving those challenges that are keeping the CISO up at night. This transitions nicely to our first question for Richard, which is, why is identity finally hitting the radar of the Chief Information Security Officer and security team?
Thanks, Aubrey. I would really say that the reason that we're seeing the identity component of security hit so strongly in the Chief Information Security Officer programs everywhere, globally, is part and parcel of a couple of different truths. And the first truth is that it's taken us a while to recognize that in the digital age, there hasn't been a single breach that's ever been executed without inappropriate or usurped access. It's just a reality. A breach is executed only through access credentials, and ultimately those access credentials are what's at stake. So as we're looking at the foundational control sets needed to keep a company safe, Chief Information Security Officers, I think globally, are recognizing that they don't stand a fighting chance protecting the perimeter, protecting through defense in depth, protecting through code scanning, through any number of other solutions, if they can't answer the simple question, do I understand who has access inside and outside to everything that is under our coverage or under our control? And as a result, I do see a recognition that if you don't get the basics of access correct, the rest of your overall security program, to overuse the term, is at risk. So Chief Information Security Officers are recognizing this and understanding that they're exposed to a weakest link syndrome. And as we talk about ownership of access, that ownership conversation is expanding well beyond individual employee user credentials. It's partners, it's customers, it's different elements within our environment of SSH keys and different types of accounts that have typically been looked at as generic or commodities and not necessarily worthy of ownership, except those types of accounts are the key methods of exploit that are being seen within bad outcomes relative to security breaches.
So this is Patrick. I'd add to that so what Richard describes is completely accurate, and I think probably in the last 5 or 6, maybe 5 to 10 years, as the notion of identity as a function of security is sort of begin to emerge and become more well known, it's actually correlated really to the rise in cloud and mobile, and the recognition that the perimeter is no longer the perimeter it once was. As more and more applications are moving to public cloud, as more organizations are leveraging SaaS applications, as more and more of their users are leveraging their mobile devices and mobile applications on those devices, the notion of doing everything behind the firewall and having an identity infrastructure that works in that world is becoming insufficient, as well as all the associated security controls that we used to rely on to provide that. and that identity has sort of emerged as a baseline mechanism that you can apply consistently across all of the applications, environments, clients, and devices, irrespective of where the user is, where the application is, where the resource is. And it becomes a foundation layer that a CISO can look to sort of get consistency across, and from there start to build out appropriate security controls and security programs from that baseline that works in this new world.
Excellent feedback, gentlemen. So let's go back for a moment, help paint this picture and build this picture a little bit out, or build it out further. And this is a two-parter, again, for Richard. How has identity been managed, thought of in the past, and why does that need to change?
Well, in the past, I'd refer back to my own personal experience. I've had the benefit of leading an identity and access management function on a massive scale, as well as after that being a chief information security officer. And what I find interesting is the experience that I had when all of that identity and access management function was handed to me. I had a corporate CIO that called me into his office, and it was, "Congratulations, way to go, it belongs to you. You have the easiest job in the world." And I kind of was taken aback by that, and I said, "How do you mean it's the easiest job in the world?" And he said, "Well, it's just onboarding and offboarding people. How hard can it be?" And I think for a long time that's been the perspective, going back to the great comment about the relevance of the perimeter in today's cloud-enabled environment. I think for a long time that access has been viewed purely as an administrative function. It's why it didn't belong to the CISO in many organizations. It's why it's bounced around through multiple segments and organizations and units within corporations, from help desk to HR to the CIO and AD and Microsoft Windows groups, and it just never really has settled into a home. And I think that's also reflective of what needs to change. The key issue that we see in access control is a lack of ownership, and ultimately that lack of ownership is driven by a problem in high-quality tools that allow a centralized or consolidated function under a single owner to be able to manage them. And I think the second part of what needs to change is that we need to recognize that individual identity is not a summation of accounts. And that's the way that identity has been looked at and viewed, and where we really need to break the model. Because if we think about the continuous comparison of analog to digital, we know that if you had multiple personalities in real life, in the analog world, we know that there will be lots of questions brought up by employers and friends and family. Yet within the digital world, we have hundreds of personalities. We have hundreds of unreconciled personalities, from our social media accounts to our work accounts to whatever other means of access we have, our customer accounts. And ultimately what needs to change is a recognition that we can't have multiple personalities as it relates to the human being and hope to win the battle related to access control. We have to be able to get to a point where we federate and understand with confidence that the person that is gaining access is who they say they are, is getting the access that is required to do their job, and that they're getting no more and no less. And that's going to require us to think about this problem differently.
Patrick, thoughts on Richard's comments?
Yes. Thanks, Aubrey. Just building on that. I mean, in the past, many organizations viewed employee identity, I'll start there, really through the lens of Active Directory as the sort of place where identity was managed, and applications were wired into Active Directory, and you would add and delete users from Active Directory, and everything was good. Sourced from there would be your HR group, which would really be authoritative for for the onboarding of new employees and the offboarding of new employees. And then within Active Directory, you would use group policies to basically decide what users could access what, in terms of group memberships and roles and things like that. And that's worked well. But again, things started to break down, as I mentioned, when we started to move to SaaS, started to move to cloud, started to leverage mobile. There was recognition that we needed MFA and password-based authentication wasn't enough. That single sign-on needed to move past just Kerberos and move out to cloud and SaaS applications. So the world changed. And the fact that it became much more complicated and you couldn't just look at your directory administrators anymore as sort of addressing all of these things, for workforce and employees anyway, is where a lot of the complexity has come in and why it's become a lot harder. You shift to partner identity, which I think is still a very unresolved issue, especially as I continue to hear about fraud related to supply chain partners or distributors or resellers who are, not deprovisioned from the partner portals or partner applications that our customers have, and are still able to, ship equipment and stuff like that to erroneous places. That all boils back to an identity problem that I still don't think is done well. When I hear, some of our customers still saying that they onboard partner identities through a fax they get from their enterprise partner saying, please add Paul, please give Paul access to this application. What never happens is the fact that those partner employees are ever deprovisioned. They might be taken out of the Active Directory of the partner organization, but that partner organization never bothers to call our customer to say, hey, please deprovision Paul from access now. So there's sort of still lots of opportunity to even address partner identity in a much better way that's been done previously in the past as well.
Okay, Patrick, thank you. And so the next question that we want to tackle, we'll actually start with you, Patrick, and something that you just touched on, partner identity, which could be considered external identity. And let's follow on that train of thought that you just had there. Why do you think external identity, let's unpack that, maybe dig a little deeper there. Why do you think external identity is just as important as employee identity?
So it's a natural extension. External identity to me means sort of the combination of partners, customers, and consumers that are accessing applications and resources inside your organization. When we're talking about partners, I'm talking about, as I said, supply chain-oriented partners, like your vendors and suppliers. I'm talking about, in situations where it's a joint venture, and it might be the employees of your competitors in some situations. And then sort of demand chain, might be, as I said, distributors, resellers, franchisees. In all of those cases, they're generally you generally have to give them access to applications that your employees get access to as well, for the purposes of collaboration and things like that. And as I mentioned, when there's both a cost associated with managing those entities of your partners that most organizations want to move away from, things as simple as password reset or credential reset, things like that. And really the goal is to move, to push the management of those identities back onto your partners, and really just take responsibility for, deciding which applications they should have access. But authentication should definitely happen, at the partner, which is where single sign-on comes in. If people get that right, it means that you never actually issue a credential to a partner. the partner organization is responsible for authentication, most likely through Active Directory and then federated single sign-on, such that when an employee at the partner, leaves or changes role, the first thing that happens is they make the appropriate change in their own Active Directory, which now means that they can't access our customer's partner portal or something like that. In the area of customer and consumer, I think that's an emerging opportunity for CISOs to really start to play a role in impacting the top line of the business by really pushing for a stronger, stronger security that also brings into place sort of a better user experience. So it's where we're sort of pushing towards moving away, and I'm going to talk about this in a second in the context of MFA, moving away from passwords to strong authentication or multi-factor authentication. Starting to take responsibility for where risk or fraud is occurring in your customer-facing applications, whether it's at account registration or whether it's at login or whether it's during certain transactions or when it's a user changing an address. Those are all security functions that really should be centrally handled within the security teams inside organizations, and not sort of the responsibility of the the different business units.
Got you. And Richard, what comments do you have based on Patrick's responses and thoughts on external identity being as important as employee identity? How do you see that?
Yeah, I'd start with the practical first, which I have to 100% agree with Patrick on, which is the external user, external ID space is rapidly moving towards a non-negotiable as it relates to multi-factor authentication. You have this huge problem as it relates to the interaction of partners and other outside actors and players relative to the simple question, are you who you say you are? And I will tell you that in the use case examples that you come across sitting in the seat as a CISO, it's astounding the complexity. It's astounding the level of connections and interconnections. One of my favorite examples of this is that upon doing an audit of a critical partner for a company that I worked for, because we were having some difficulties that were hinting at fraud, we went and did a user access review of the entire company that we were doing business with, only to find that we had about 38 people that were accessing our systems through one account. That account was shared. The information relative to that account had been shared. And what's interesting is that the actual owner of that account had been set up and established about 10 or 12 years prior and had left the company about 5 or 6 years before that. So we've got a major credibility issue in our interactions with a customer from an external ID standpoint, just simply because we don't know who they are. And we simply can't take on the accountability for authenticating that. So I agree 100%. Pushing that authentication responsibility back to the owning party is definitely a necessity, and is a space where the entire access control universe is going to need to move to. It's interesting in that realm of complexity of use cases. If we think about corporate clients, we tend to think about the reality that we face with partners versus customers versus suppliers versus single point vendors. And then if we expand that out and start to think about other use cases, think about hospital networks or think about universities, where I could put in an application as a 17-year-old kid and become a candidate, and then my ID transports with me when I become a student. But 2 years in, I become a research assistant. And then 4 years later, I become an alumni. And after that, I'm working for a foundation and I'm doing a research program. And in those cases, we see that ID perpetuating both internal and external for that individual over their entire lifetime. And so these things have to be taken into account, because it's not just how important is the external actor and how important is for us to be able to manage that identity, but how do we also manage the fact that Sometimes they can be internal, they can be external, or they could be both at the same time.
Right. So we can take away from that federated identity management and federated access management and services are going to be key to helping solve this problem. But Richard, I want to come back to you for a moment and just ask you about some of the forces, in particular regulatory forces that often drive change, right? Those are often the catalysts for change. Are there any regulatory forces that you can comment on that are impacting some of the access management decisions that companies in a particular vertical, such as financial or healthcare, will have to begin to manage and comply with?
Absolutely. I think that where we see the federal regulatory agencies going within both banking and insurance is pushing an expectation and demand of much more agility relative to response about who has access to what within your environment. We're seeing pre-notifications for regulatory actions that are getting ready to be established, where we're seeing very specific statements about access control and the quality of access control to a degree that we've not seen before. We're seeing other state-based regulatory agencies that are pushing insurance companies for much better management and responsiveness to their access universe. And what we know is that we're also seeing what I can only qualify as catastrophic events relative to access, not the individual bad actor that executes a hack, a breach, or an exploit. What we see is situations where regulatory in combination with law enforcement shows up at a site where something has gone wrong and is requiring investigation that can be completely outside of the control of that corporation. It could be a situation of illegal trading, or a situation of money laundering, or a situation of HIPAA fraud. And we see this situation where people are showing up on site and saying, you have X number of hours to produce information about who has access to this specific application or this particular data store, and it must be 100% accurate and error-free, go. And we're seeing companies that are struggling very, very hard with that demand. But unfortunately, that's where we see things going. It's a need and a demand, and it's just as simple as this. If we reflect back to the analog, it's just as simple as the regulators saying, if you distributed 17,000 keys for all the padlocks and door locks in your building, you must be able to account for all 17,000 keys and who has them. Every one of those access credentials is a key unto itself, and it's not an unachievable or an inappropriate expectation for regulators to say you need to account for all of those keys. Unfortunately, because of the history of the development of software applications, hardware devices, mainframe systems that were never built with security in mind at the initial stages, now we find ourselves in a situation to backfit access control and security into those applications and try and find all 17,000 of those keys. And that's really where the regulators are driving us. Full transparency, knowledge, understanding, and speed in response relative to who has access to what.
Lots of great comments there, Richard, and certainly something for our CISOs to be aware of and understand that, again, there's going to be impact for them. I want to come back to Patrick and something Richard talked about related to keys and credentials. And it's a very simple question, Patrick. Can we really get rid of passwords?
So the answer to that is going to actually be yes. And I think everybody understands why. Obviously with password, account takeover and credential, and stolen credentials being the number one reason that people basically have account takeover, which obviously then leads to all sorts of fraud and data breach. I think the initial goal doesn't actually need to be about getting rid of passwords. The initial goal should be supplementing the password with an additional factor of authentication to get to 2FA or MFA. Anybody who is not thinking about doing that today is crazy. It's just unfathomable to me that an organization is not looking at supplementing their password login with an additional factor of authentication for everything that users should be accessing. That alone will essentially address many of the issues that people have with a password and data breach. And the technology exists today. This isn't like your Secure ID token of 1998 that everybody hated. The technology exists today for the smartphone to be used as a strong authenticator, along with push notifications or SMS over OTP, any number of mechanisms that actually have a pretty good user experience and are reasonably cost-effective, and don't have a lot of the provisioning problems and cost problems associated with previous technology. You combine that with single sign-on so that you centralize where login and MFA occurs, and then enable single sign-on to the myriad of applications that users need access to. You can actually have a fairly cost-effective and easy-to-use sort of MFA solution in place relatively quickly. The fact that people aren't doing that, again, it's a travesty. Looking forward, right. I think we get to a point. We can get to a point where we can start to incorporate risk and fraud and behavioral analysis, and essentially starting to reduce the number of times users need to authenticate because of the behavioral analysis and the underlying continuous authentication models are constantly checking when and if that user is still Patrick in certain situations, to the point where the act of actually logging in diminishes and diminishes and diminishes over time. And eventually, I think that the password can actually start to disappear because we'll have all sorts of other signals in place that will allow us to determine that Patrick is really Patrick when he's accessing these applications. Right.
So would you, and I'll flip this to Richard, and my perspective is this might be an opportunity based on what Patrick described, cost and time to delivery and barriers of entry. This might be an opportunity for a CISO who does not currently own identity to embrace identity and begin to build their identity program or begin to insert themselves into the identity access management projects and programs. Richard, would you agree with that the opportunity to begin to get rid of passwords, maybe through intelligent multi-factor authentication or some effort like that combined with single sign-on, would be an opportunity for a CISO to embrace identity?
Absolutely. It becomes a security architecture discussion. And if we migrate the access function into a CISO space, and they're looking at it and saying, okay, I'm going to take this on, but I can't take it on in its current condition because the guiding paradigm or the guiding framework has been all about access administration, or it's been all about ease of access, or it's been all about, frankly, it's all been about timeliness of SLA response, right? I gave people access really, really fast, as opposed to I gave people appropriate access in the time necessary to do their job. As CISO's got the capability to take a look at that and apply that security mindset and say, I really don't think that we've ever looked at this function from a secure standpoint. So let's begin to build those capabilities in as we absorb and take on this function. And the reality is, again, I have to agree with Patrick. The idea of passwords going away, it's a sensitive question. If we bring that question up in the case of a forum or a conference or a dinner, and and immediately jump out and say, yes, passwords are obsolete, then we see a lot of eye rolling from people that sit in the operational seat and go, there go these theoretical guys again. But here's the truth. We can look to history for this. We know that when we look to history and look at the development of security, in every case, the construction of padlocks, the changing of the mathematics and algorithms relative to encryption keys, all these things that we've said in the past, we can't make these leaps into more and more secure technologies. Obviously, that's not been the case. We know that we're going to see things like pattern recognition and analysis of behaviors that can be used for authentication. We know that we're going to see changes in our capability to see, hear, understand the conditions of a person's role and function that'll go way beyond typing in a password. So it takes a CISO to look at that, not just from the current state, but to say 2, 3, 5, 7 years down the line, from a security standpoint, what components of manual support, life support, and control do I want to be in, and how much of that do I want to move to a space where it's faster, safer, and cheaper because it's automated, it's connected, it's rule-based, it's being driven by a system that is entirely focused on making sure that you are who you say you are and you have access to what you need.
Outstanding. Patrick, back to you. So for CISOs in the audience or that are listening, what are a few thoughts that you would impart to them in terms of what they should do next?
So nobody wants more work. It's rare. But I think certainly from what we've seen at Ping, SSO and mobile MFA are security technologies, certainly SSO anyway, that actually can improve the user experience. And every CISO would love to have a piece of technology that they put in place, they can call their own, that is actually providing a better experience than not having it there. It's a very, very rare thing. SSO definitely gives them that. I think the end user recognition that MFA is necessary, and some of the technologies that are emerging today around sort of mobile-based MFA, again, great user experience. So when you can provide security with good user experience, it's a win-win all around. That would be my recommendation on where to start. I think there is obviously a plethora of other areas that organizations are trying to chase down today. It's almost like whack-a-mole, certainly with all the SaaS applications around shadow IT that are emerging, that they have to get under control. And in that regard, one of the better ways to understand and control how users are accessing SaaS applications is to take ownership of the authentication to those SaaS applications and move it back to the enterprise. And that way, when your users are looking to access those SaaS applications, the first thing they have to do is to come back to the enterprise to authenticate. You can start to enforce additional security controls there, such that you can do things like endpoint protection, add MFA in, things like that before they can actually access those SaaS applications. So, another area I think of low-hanging fruit there to embrace where organizations are going in their need and want to use SaaS, but providing an appropriate level of control that they can be comfortable that their users are accessing those SaaS applications safely.
Great. And Richard, thoughts on, CISOs who, again, may be looking to either expand what they're doing with identity depending on what aspects of identity they may own, or those that don't and are looking to embrace identity. What are your thoughts as far as what they should do next?
I think first and foremost, a CISO that's looking at either taking on an access control function or improving it just simply needs to make a choice. And that choice is stop looking at it as a burden and look at it as a keystone for their entire program. Look at it as the method necessary for the improvement of every aspect of security. I love what Patrick said. The fact of the matter is that if you know who somebody is, then you're able to invoke and optimize your already existing technology solutions relative to security. You're going to get a better outcome because knowing who that person is, knowing their account structure, knowing what they have access to, and being able to authenticate that allows you to make all those other tools run better, run faster, run automated. So it's a potential for much better economic gains relative to your investment. It's a potential for a much more secure and safe environment. You can't look at it as a burden. You have to look at it and say, if I have the ability to control the end result of a potential security breach, exploit, or hack at its very beginnings, where somebody is stealing, usurping, or misusing credentials, then I don't have to worry about the effectiveness of all of the other controls. I'm going to be successful in keeping my company, my organization, my entity safe, and that in and of itself just confirms that it's not a burden, because as we all know, it's much cheaper to make sure that it's done right on the front side as opposed to doing the forensic scrambling and necessary mitigation to solve for something that's gone bad with one single access credential.
Right, I couldn't agree more. To the comments from Patrick and Richard, I would just add relative to the different varying cybersecurity investments that organizations have made. One other path, or in addition to these other things that you would want to, CISO may want to tackle, would be to begin to inventory what you own and understand the technologies that you have that have some identity context. Not that you may be able to take advantage of that or that it's interoperable right out of the box at that very moment, but just understanding that, I think, can certainly provide value. So to wrap up, if we can evolve and adapt our security model, leveraging identity, then we can build trust and confidence, and that creates value. We can enable convenient but secure business to enterprise, business to consumer, and business to business relationships, a shift from reactive to proactive security, which Patrick and Richard have both talked about, and the continuous and seamless connection of any user to any resource, from any device to any service. We can begin to realize that, but in a secure fashion. And we've covered a lot of ground in this brief time, but to learn more, please join us at the 2017 Cloud Identity Summit on June 19th through the 22nd in Chicago. We would love to have you there, and it is another opportunity to learn a great deal more about what we've discussed today, as well as begin to take action on some of the topics that we've covered and that may be of interest and relevant to you as well. There is a registration promo code, Optiv30, that we implore you to use, so you can join us again at the Cloud Identity Summit this year.
Thank you for joining us today for this Optiv webinar presentation. We hope that you found it both educational and informative. A recording of today's presentation will be available and a link will be emailed to you soon. To view our upcoming webinars, thought leadership conversations, and events, please visit the About Us section on our website at optiv.com. If you would like to have a conversation with an Optiv client manager, please call 866-729-7707 or send a request using the Contact Us section of our website. We also invite you to share your comments about this presentation by completing our survey that will be included in the email you will be receiving soon, or email us directly at campaigns@optiv.com. Thank you again, and we hope you will join us soon for another presentation.